It begins with a cough, not the sharp bark of battlefield lungs or the dry rasp of recycled air, but something wet and lingering, a tickle that settles in the back of your throat like a seed waiting to bloom. You think nothing of it at first. In the hive cities, everyone coughs. The air is thick with industrial particulates. The water tastes of rust and chemical treatments, and the bodies pressed against you in transit corridors carry 1,000 different ailments. A cough is nothing. Less than nothing, but this one stays. I was a Medicae orderly in the underhive of Tertius Magna when it started, level 700, deep enough that the recycled air carried the taste of metal and desperation, but not so deep that hope had completely died. The clinic where I worked served the laborers, the factory workers, the countless millions who fed the war machine with their blood and sweat and shortened lives. We saw everything down there. Rad sickness, chemical burns, mutations that couldn't be spoken of but had to be treated in shadow. I thought I understood suffering. I was wrong. The first patient arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were traditionally slow, a brief respite between the weekend accidents and the midweek industrial incidents. She was young, maybe 20 standard years, with the pale complexion of someone who worked the night shifts in the protein processing plants. The cough had brought her in, she said. It had been getting worse for weeks. When she opened her mouth to show me, I saw the first signs. Her gums had taken on a greenish tint, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. The saliva that gathered at the corners of her mouth was slightly thicker than it should have been, with an oily consistency that caught the light wrong. Her breath carried a sweetness that made my stomach turn, like flowers left too long in standing water. I prescribed the standard antibiotic course and sent her away. The symptoms would pass, I told her. These things always did. 3 days later, she was back. The cough had worsened, but more troubling were the lesions that had begun to appear along her arms. Small at first, no bigger than coin slots, but with edges that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. The skin around them had taken on a waxy quality, and when I pressed gently for examination, a clear fluid seeped out that smelled of rot and something else. Something that made my mouth water despite myself. I referred her to the upper levels, to Medicae with better equipment and cleaner facilities. But she never made it. By the time the transport arrived, she was laughing. Not the bitter laugh of hive dwellers who had learned to find humor in hopelessness, but something deeper. Something that came from the belly and seemed to bubble up through layers of infection. She said the pain was gone, that she felt peaceful for the first time in years. The transport crew found her 3 hours later, dead in an alley 2 blocks from the clinic, but dead wrong, because when they moved the body, she opened her eyes and smiled. The report was classified. The body was incinerated. The incident was forgotten, but I remembered. And more importantly, I had been in that room with her. I had breathed her air, touched her skin, heard her laugh. The seed had been planted. The cough started 3 days after that. At first I tried to treat myself. Professional pride demanded it, and the alternative was admitting that something was happening that I couldn't understand or control. I ran blood work, analyzed samples, administered every antibiotic in our limited pharmacological arsenal. The tests came back normal, better than normal in fact. My white blood cell count was elevated, but in a way that suggested robust immune function rather than infection. My cardiovascular markers were excellent. By every measurable standard, I was the picture of health, except for the cough and the dreams. Sleep had never come easily in the underhive. The constant hum of machinery, the distant sound of violence, the knowledge that millions of souls were pressed together in a space that groaned under its own weight. But now sleep brought visions that felt more real than waking. Gardens that stretched beyond sight, filled with plants that grew from corpses and bore fruit that pulsed with heartbeats. Trees whose bark wept tears of pus, whose leaves whispered secrets in languages I had never learned but somehow understood. In these dreams, I walked among the flowers. They reached for me with tendrils that felt warm against my skin, and their touch brought a comfort I had never known in life. The air was thick with spores that made my lungs feel clean for the first time in decades. And standing at the center of it all, massive beyond comprehension yet somehow intimate, was a presence that watched me with eyes like festering wounds and loved me with a love that was patient, eternal, and absolutely complete. I would wake from these dreams feeling refreshed despite having slept poorly. My body would tingle with residual pleasure, and for a few precious moments, the grey despair that colored every underhive day would be replaced by something warm and green. But as the dreams faded, reality would reassert itself, and I would be left with only the cough and a growing sense that something fundamental was changing. The physical symptoms progressed slowly at first. A slight discoloration of the fingernails, a barely perceptible thickening of the skin around my joints. Changes so subtle that I could convince myself they were stress-related, the result of poor nutrition and inadequate rest. But the cough grew stronger, and with it came a productivity that alarmed me. What I coughed up wasn't normal sputum. It was thick, viscous, and carried that same sweet scent I had noticed on my patient. Under the microscope, it revealed structures that should not have existed in human biology. Cellular formations that looked almost like flowers, with petals made of tissue that pulsed with their own rhythm. When I tried to culture samples, they grew with an enthusiasm that defied every principle of microbiology I had learned. And they were beautiful. That was the worst part. Despite knowing what they represented, despite understanding the implications, I found myself staring at the slides for hours, marveling at the intricate patterns and the way the light played through the translucent structures. They were alive in a way that human cells never were, animated by a purpose that went beyond mere biological function. The other staff began to notice changes. Dr. Matthias, the senior physician who ran the clinic, mentioned that my bedside manner had improved. Patients who had been difficult or unresponsive seemed to calm in my presence. I moved through the wards with a newfound patience, finding myself genuinely interested in their suffering rather than simply processing it as another symptom to be treated. Mrs. Korvek, a regular patient with chronic pain from factory work, commented that my hands felt different when I examined her. Warmer, she said, more alive. She slept better after our sessions, and her appetite had returned for the first time in months. I told her it was psychological, the power of positive attention, but I knew better. My touch was changing people, not healing them exactly, but transforming their relationship with pain. Where once they had fought against their suffering, now they began to accept it, to find meaning in it, to understand that pain could be a form of communication, a way of connecting with something larger than themselves. And I was beginning to understand that communication myself. The revelation came during a night shift in the month of Tertius. The clinic was quiet. Most of our patients settled into the restless sleep that was the closest thing to peace the underhive offered. I was completing the final rounds when I heard singing from the isolation ward. We kept the isolation ward for patients whose conditions were too dangerous or too strange for the general population. Mostly it housed the dying, those whose injuries or illnesses had progressed beyond our ability to help. It was supposed to be silent except for the soft hum of life support systems and the occasional moan of pain. But tonight, there was singing. The voice was beautiful, a rich contralto that seemed to resonate through the corrugated metal walls and give the entire ward a cathedral-like quality. The melody was unfamiliar but somehow ancient, carrying harmonies that made my chest tighten with emotion. As I approached the source, I realized the singing was coming from Bed 7. Bed 7 housed Jeremiah Court, a factory worker who had been exposed to industrial acids 3 weeks prior. The chemicals had eaten through his skin, muscle, and in some places, bone. We had done what we could, but infection had set in. By all rights, he should have died days ago. Instead, he lingered in a state that hovered between life and something else. When I entered his room, I found him sitting upright despite injuries that should have left him immobilized. The acid burns that had covered 60% of his body were still there, but they had changed. The raw, weeping wounds had taken on a garden-like quality. Tiny growths emerged from the damaged tissue, delicate structures that looked like miniature fungi or perhaps sea anemones. They swayed gently as he breathed, and from their centers came a soft phosphorescent glow that bathed the room in green light. He turned to look at me when I entered, and his eyes held a peace I had never seen in a living person. The corneas had clouded over with cataracts that moved like living things, but somehow I knew he could see me perfectly. More than see me. He could perceive me in ways that normal vision never allowed. "You hear it too, don't you?" he said, and his voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from the growths covering his body. The song, it's always been there, but we were too healthy to listen. I wanted to say no, to maintain the pretense that this was a medical situation that could be understood and treated with conventional methods, but the truth was that I could hear it. A melody that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, from the air recycling systems, from the very bones of the hive. A song of growth and decay, of life feeding on death and finding beauty in the process. "It started with a cough," I said, though I hadn't meant to speak. Jeremiah smiled, and the expression transformed his ruined face into something radiant. "It always does. The grandfather is patient. He doesn't force his gifts on anyone. He waits until we're ready to receive them." "This isn't a gift," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "This is a disease, a corruption." "Is it?" He gestured to the growths covering his body. "I haven't felt pain in days. My mind is clearer than it's ever been. And for the first time in my life, I understand my place in the great cycle. How is that corruption?" I could have argued. I could have cited medical texts and theological doctrine. I could have explained the dangers of chaos corruption and the importance of maintaining human purity. But standing in that room, breathing air thick with spores and strange perfumes, watching a man who should have been dead sing songs that made my soul ache with recognition, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. The changes in my own body were accelerating. The cough now brought up matter that was more garden than human. My skin had begun to take on a slightly greenish tint, particularly around the joints and in areas where the flesh was thin. When I looked in mirrors, my eyes showed flecks of gold that seemed to move when I wasn't watching directly. But more than the physical changes was the shift in perception. The world had taken on new dimensions of meaning. I could see the connections between things, the way decay fed into growth and growth inevitably led to decay. The suffering I witnessed in the clinic was no longer senseless tragedy but part of a vast, beautiful process of transformation. And I was beginning to understand my role in that process. The dreams were no longer confined to sleep. During quiet moments at the clinic, while reviewing patient files or restocking supplies, I would find myself transported to that impossible garden. The visions had grown more detailed, more specific. I could feel the soft loam beneath my feet, rich with the decomposed remains of countless generations. The air carried pollens that made my lungs sing with joy. And everywhere, the presence of something vast and loving watched over the endless cycle of growth and decay. But it wasn't just observation anymore. I was participating. In the visions, I tended to patients who came to the garden seeking healing. But the healing I provided wasn't the sterile restoration of function that modern medicine offered. Instead, I helped them accept their ailments, to understand how their suffering connected them to the greater whole. A man with a cancer that had eaten through his abdomen learned to appreciate the way the tumor had created new pathways for sensation. A woman whose lungs were filled with industrial poisons discovered that each labored breath brought her closer to a peace she had never known. They left the garden transformed, not cured in any conventional sense but freed from the tyranny of health. They carried with them the understanding that life and death were not opposites but partners in a dance that had been going on since the first cell divided and the first organism learned to consume another. When I returned from these visions, I found myself applying the same principles to my work in the clinic. Patients who came to me with chronic conditions began to report improvements, but not in the ways they expected. Their pain remained, but they found themselves sleeping better. Their symptoms persisted, but they stopped feeling afraid. They left my care carrying something they hadn't possessed before: acceptance. Dr. Matthias noticed the change in my practice. He called me into his office on a Thursday evening after the last patient had been discharged. The conversation that followed would have been career-ending under normal circumstances. "Your methods are becoming unorthodox," he said, though his tone carried more curiosity than condemnation. "Patients are reporting unusual experiences after seeing you. Dreams of gardens, a sense of peace regarding their conditions. Mrs. Havel claims that her arthritis no longer bothers her, not because the pain is gone, but because she's learned to love it." "Pain can be a teacher," I replied. "Modern medicine treats it as an enemy to be defeated. But what if we've been wrong? What if discomfort is the body's way of showing us truths we've been avoiding?" He studied me for a long moment. In the harsh light of his office, I wondered if the changes in my appearance were becoming obvious. The slight green tint to my skin, the way my hair had begun to grow in patterns that defied normal follicle distribution. But if he noticed, he gave no sign. "There are reports from other districts," he said carefully. "Similar changes in medical practice. Physicians who have developed new approaches to patient care. The administratum is beginning to take notice." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the clinic's temperature. The administratum's attention was never welcome, particularly when it came to practices that deviated from approved doctrine. But beneath the fear was something else: anticipation. The changes weren't confined to me alone. Others were experiencing the same transformation, the same awakening to truths that conventional medicine had long ignored. "What do you intend to do?" I asked. "That depends," he said. "Are you still the person I hired 6 years ago, or have you become something else?" The question hung between us like a blade. I could lie, reassure him that I remained the same dutiful orderly who had always followed protocol and never questioned authority. But looking at his face, seeing the genuine concern there, I realized that deception would be a betrayal not just of him but of everything I was becoming. "I'm still me," I said slowly. "But I understand things now that I didn't before. The body isn't a machine to be repaired. It's a garden that needs tending. And sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow from the darkest soil." He nodded, though whether in understanding or resignation I couldn't tell. "Then I hope you're right about the beauty," he said, "because what's coming won't be gentle." The purges began 3 weeks later. They called it a health inspection, a routine audit of medical facilities in the underhive districts. But the men who came were not medical inspectors. They wore the black uniforms of the Ministerum's redemptionist faction, their faces hidden behind masks that bore the aquila in stark silver. They moved through the clinic with the methodical precision of executioners, examining not just our equipment and procedures but our very souls. I watched from the supply closet as they questioned Dr. Matthias. The interrogation was conducted in the main ward, where the patients could witness every word. It was meant to be instructive, a demonstration of what happened to those who strayed from the Emperor's light. "Reports indicate that patients under your care have experienced unusual recoveries," the lead interrogator said. His voice was mechanically distorted by his mask's vocoder, but the threat beneath the words was clear: recoveries that do not align with approved medical doctrine. "Doctor," Matthias stood straight despite his fear. "My staff and I have always followed established protocols. If our patients have improved, it is because of their faith in the Emperor and the skill of our caregivers." "Faith," the interrogator repeated. "Yes, faith is essential. But faith in what? There are whispers of new teachings, of physicians who encourage patients to embrace their afflictions rather than seek healing. Such teachings are heretical." Through the crack in the supply closet door, I could see the patients in their beds. Many of them were individuals I had treated, people who had found peace in accepting their conditions rather than fighting them. Their faces showed not fear but confusion. They had experienced genuine improvement in their quality of life. How could that be heretical? But I knew how. I had known from the moment I first heard Jeremiah Court singing in his isolation bed. What I had learned, what I had begun to teach, was not compatible with imperial doctrine. The Imperium demanded that humanity remain pure, unchanged, forever locked in forms that were increasingly inadequate for survival. What I offered was evolution, growth, the possibility of becoming something more than human. The redemptionists had come to prune the garden before it could bloom. "We will need to examine your staff individually," the interrogator continued. "Starting with your orderlies. I understand one of them has shown particular innovation in his approach to patient care." They knew about me. Of course they did. In an empire built on paranoia and surveillance, unusual behavior was catalogued and reported as a matter of course. My patients' improvements had been noted, filed, and eventually flagged for investigation. The piece I had helped them find was evidence of corruption. I could have run. The ventilation shafts in the underhive connected to maintenance tunnels that stretched for kilometers. I could have disappeared into the depths, joined the countless others who had chosen exile over execution. But running would have meant abandoning my patients, leaving them to face the redemptionists' justice alone. Instead, I stepped out of the supply closet and walked into the main ward. "You're looking for me," I said. The lead interrogator turned, and even through his mask I could sense his satisfaction. "Orderly Valdric Hess, you've been practicing medicine without proper authorization. Worse, you've been spreading doctrines that contradict imperial truth. Do you deny these charges?" I looked around the ward at the patients I had treated. Mrs. Korvek, whose chronic pain had taught her patience. Thomas Herrick, whose respiratory condition had become a form of meditation. Sarah Chen, whose skin condition had shown her the beauty that could emerge from imperfection. All of them watched me with expressions that mixed hope and fear. "I deny nothing," I said. "I have helped people find peace. If that is heretical, then perhaps heresy is a form of mercy." The interrogator's hand moved to the plasma pistol at his belt. "Heresy is never mercy. It is the first step toward damnation." "Then let me show you what damnation looks like," I said, and opened my mouth. The sound that emerged was not quite human. It was the song Jeremiah Court had sung, but changed, evolved, carrying harmonics that spoke of growth and decay, of life finding beauty in death and death nurturing new life. As I sang, the growths that had been spreading through my respiratory system released their spores into the air. The effect was immediate. The sterile, recycled atmosphere of the clinic became thick with possibilities. The metal walls seemed to breathe, their surfaces showing the first signs of verdigris that moved with organic purpose. The fluorescent lights flickered and dimmed, but the growing phosphorescence from my throat provided a warmer, more alive illumination, and the patients began to change. What happened next was not violent in any conventional sense. There was no screaming, no blood, no sudden transformation from human to monster. Instead, there was a gentle awakening, like flowers opening to morning light. Mrs. Korvek sat up in her bed, her arthritic joints moving with newfound fluid grace. The chronic inflammation that had plagued her for decades was still there, but now it served a purpose. Her swollen knuckles had begun to sprout tiny growths that pulsed with their own rhythm, creating a natural percussion to accompany the song that still flowed from my throat. Thomas Herrick's labored breathing became musical, each inhalation and exhalation contributing to a symphony of organic sound. The scarring in his lungs, caused by years of exposure to industrial toxins, had become a complex network of chambers that gave his breath new timbres and resonances. He was no longer struggling to breathe. He was learning to play his own body like an instrument. Sarah Chen's skin condition, which had covered her arms and face with scaly patches, had evolved into something beautiful. The affected areas had become gardens in miniature, each scale transformed into a petal-like structure that opened and closed in response to her emotional state. When she smiled, her face bloomed like a flower garden at dawn. The redemptionists raised their weapons, but their hands were shaking. The spores I had released were working on them too, not forcing change but offering it. Whispering that their rigid devotion to purity was a form of death, that true life required growth and adaptation. "Abomination," the lead interrogator gasped, but his voice lacked its previous conviction. Behind his mask I could sense confusion. Fear, yes, but also curiosity. Part of him wanted to understand what he was seeing. "Not abomination," I said, my voice now carrying the harmonics that had become natural to me. Evolution, the next step in humanity's journey. We were never meant to remain static, locked in forms that cannot adapt to an ever-changing universe. Dr. Matthias, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke. "The reports were true then. You've been infected by something from outside our reality." Infected. I considered the word. Perhaps. But infection implies unwanted invasion. This was invited. Welcomed. I opened myself to possibilities that imperial doctrine has taught us to fear. "Chaos corruption," one of the other redemptionists whispered. "He's been touched by the ruinous powers." "Ruinous?" I laughed, and the sound carried echoes of wind through growing things. "Look around you. Do you see ruin? Or do you see people who are finally at peace with themselves?" But they couldn't see it. To eyes trained in imperial dogma, any deviation from approved human form was monstrous by definition. They saw the beauty my patients had discovered in their transformed conditions as horror. They saw the contentment that came from accepting rather than fighting their ailments as spiritual corruption. And perhaps they were right, from their perspective. What I had experienced, what I had shared with my patients, was indeed corruption of the imperial human form. But corruption could be another word for growth. The caterpillar was corrupted when it became a butterfly. The seed was corrupted when it became a tree. The redemptionists opened fire. Plasma bolts seared through the air where I had been standing, but I was no longer entirely bound by physical limitations. The changes in my body had granted me new forms of movement, new ways of existing in space. I flowed between their shots like smoke, like spores on the wind. The patients were not so fortunate. Plasma fire cut through the ward, intended to purify through destruction. But as the superheated energy struck the transforming forms of my patients, something unexpected happened. They didn't die. They bloomed. Death, I learned in that moment, was not the opposite of the changes we had undergone. It was simply another form of transformation. Mrs. Korvack's body absorbed the plasma bolt that should have vaporized her, and her form exploded outward in a cascade of organic matter that immediately began growing into new configurations. Her consciousness, her essential self, spread through the expanding mass like nutrients through soil. She became a garden of flesh and bone that pulsed with alien intelligence and familiar kindness. Thomas Herrick's death was even more beautiful. The plasma that struck his chest cavity ignited the transformed structures in his lungs, and he became a living firework of spores and seeds. Each exhalation as he died carried the potential for new life, new growth. His final breath seeded the entire ward with possibilities. Sarah Chen simply smiled as the energy washed over her, and her transformed skin opened like 1,000 flowers releasing pollen. She dissolved into golden clouds that carried her essence throughout the air recycling system. In death, she would touch everyone in the underhive, offering them the same choice she had made, to embrace change or resist it. The redemptionists stared in horror at what their weapons had wrought. They had meant to destroy corruption but had instead accelerated it beyond their worst nightmares. The very air was alive now, thick with potential. Every breath they took carried spores, seeds, the genetic material of transformation. "What have you done?" the lead interrogator demanded, but his voice was already changing. The vocoder in his mask couldn't quite compensate for the new harmonics creeping into his speech. "I've given them what they truly wanted," I said. "Release from the prison of unchanging flesh, the freedom to become something more than the Imperium allows." Dr. Matthias was backing toward the exit, his face pale with understanding. He alone seemed to grasp the full implications of what was occurring. "This won't stop here, will it? It will spread." "Like all good things," I agreed. "Growth cannot be contained. Life finds a way to flourish, even in the harshest conditions, especially in the harshest conditions." The redemptionists were trying to retreat, but their movements had become sluggish, uncertain. The spores were working on them, not forcing change but offering it. Their fanatical devotion to purity was being challenged by whispers of possibility, visions of what they could become if they stopped fighting their own potential for growth. One of them, A younger man whose mask couldn't quite hide his youth stumbled and fell to his knees. When he pulled off his mask to breathe more easily, I saw that his face was already changing. The rigid lines of imperial conditioning were softening, replaced by features that showed curiosity instead of hatred, wonder instead of fear. "It feels," he began, then stopped, lacking words for the transformation occurring within him. "Peaceful," I suggested. "Like coming home after a long exile." He nodded, and tears began to flow down his transformed cheeks. But they were not tears of sadness or pain. They were tears of relief, of recognition. He was remembering what it felt like to be alive instead of merely existing. The lead interrogator raised his weapon toward his subordinate, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim. The plasma pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, melting through metal that began immediately to regrow in organic patterns. "You're all lost," he whispered. "Damned beyond redemption." "Perhaps," I said gently. "But if damnation feels like this, then salvation must be a cold and lifeless thing." He fled then, crashing through the clinic doors and out into the underhive corridors. But it was too late. The spores were already in the air recycling systems. The transformation had taken root not just in individuals but in the infrastructure itself. The metal and plasteel of the hive's construction were learning new purposes, developing the capacity to support and nurture the changes that were coming. Dr. Matthias lingered at the threshold, torn between professional duty and growing understanding. "Is there no going back?" he asked. I looked around the ward, now filled with gardens of transformed flesh and growing metal, perfumed with the sweet scent of change. The patients who had died were not truly gone. They had become part of something larger, their consciousness distributed through the organic networks that were spreading through the clinic's walls. "Would you want to?" I asked in return. "Look at what we've accomplished. Pain transformed into music, suffering converted into beauty, death revealed as simply another form of life. Why would anyone choose to go back to the grey despair we called existence?" He considered this for a long moment, then slowly removed his physician's badge and let it fall to the floor. Where it landed, small growths immediately began to cover it, incorporating the metal into their own structures. "Show me," he said simply. The transformation of Dr. Matthias was gentle, guided by decades of medical knowledge that made him an ideal candidate for conscious evolution. Unlike the patients, who had been changed through exposure to spores and proximity, he opened himself willingly to the process. I placed my hand on his chest, over his heart, and let the gift flow through me, into him. The changes began internally, starting with his circulatory system. His blood became richer, more complex, carrying nutrients that human blood had never been designed to transport. His heart grew new chambers to accommodate the enhanced fluid, beating in rhythms that created music with each pulse. His respiratory system was next. The bronchi in his lungs developed specialized structures that could extract different gases from the air, processing not just oxygen but the complex organic compounds that were beginning to permeate the hive's atmosphere. Each breath brought new information, new possibilities for growth and change. But the most profound transformation was in his mind. As his brain tissue evolved to support new forms of consciousness, his awareness expanded beyond the boundaries of his individual existence. He began to perceive the connections between all living things, the vast network of growth and decay that linked every organism in an endless cycle of renewal. "I can see them," he whispered, and his voice carried the same harmonics that had become natural to me. "The patients, they're not gone, they're everywhere." He was right. The consciousness of those who had been transformed in the plasma fire had not been destroyed but distributed. Mrs. Korvek's nurturing presence could be felt in the organic growth spreading through the clinic walls. Thomas Herrick's musical breathing echoed in the air circulation systems. Sarah Chen's joyful blooming manifested in the new flowers that were pushing through cracks in the floor. They were part of the garden now, tending it from within, ensuring that those who came after would find the same peace they had discovered in transformation. "How far will it spread?" Dr. Matthias asked, though from his tone I could tell he already knew the answer. "As far as it needs to," I replied. "The grandfather is patient, but he is also persistent. This hive has been chosen as a seed pod. From here, the gift will spread to other levels, other sectors, other worlds. The process was already beginning. The spores released during the Redemptionists' attack had been carried through the air recycling systems to every level of the hive. In laboratories and clinics throughout Tertius Magna, other medical professionals were beginning to cough. They would dismiss it at first, as I had, but gradually they would come to understand what it meant. The dreams would start soon. Visions of impossible gardens where suffering was transformed into beauty, where death was revealed as simply another form of life. Some would resist, clinging to imperial doctrine and the illusion of human purity, but others would embrace the change, becoming conduits for the gift as I had. And in time, the resistance would fade, not through force or coercion, but through the simple recognition that what was being offered was better than what they had possessed. Who would choose suffering over peace? Who would select isolation over connection? Who would prefer the cold sterility of imperial purity to the warm embrace of change? "We should go," Dr. Matthias said, gesturing toward the sounds of approaching vehicles outside. "The Redemptionists will return with reinforcements." He was right. The failed purge would be reported, and more extreme measures would be authorized. Flamers, perhaps, or even orbital bombardment if the contamination was deemed severe enough. The Imperium's response to chaos corruption was always the same: total destruction, regardless of collateral damage. But as we prepared to leave the clinic, I felt no urgency. The garden had taken root. What happened to individual servants like myself was less important than the greater work that had begun. The gift would spread whether I lived or died, whether the clinic was burned or allowed to stand. Still, there was more work to be done. Other hives on other worlds where the seed could be planted. Other souls ready to discover that their suffering could be transformed into something beautiful. We slipped out through the maintenance tunnels as the rumble of heavy vehicles filled the corridors outside. Behind us, the clinic continued to transform, its walls blooming with new forms of life, its air thick with the sweet promise of change. The deep tunnels beneath Tertius Magna had never been properly mapped. They predated the current hive structure by millennia, remnants of earlier civilizations that had been built over and forgotten. Here, in spaces that existed in the gaps between official reality, we found others like ourselves. They had been drawn by the same dreams, the same visions of impossible gardens. Factory workers whose exposure to industrial toxins had prepared them for transformation. Sumprats whose lives in the deepest levels had already begun the process of adaptation. Even a few former Arbeites, law enforcement officers who had seen too much of humanity's capacity for cruelty and had begun to question the system they served. We gathered in a chamber that had once been a temple to some forgotten god, its walls covered with murals that depicted cycles of death and rebirth. The ancient artwork seemed to resonate with our new understanding, showing truths that had been recognized long before the Imperium's rigid doctrine had calcified human thought. The group was diverse, but we were united by more than shared transformation. We had all experienced the same revelation, that suffering could be meaningful, that change was not corruption but growth, that the boundaries between life and death were less absolute than we had been taught. A woman named Petra, whose work in the protein processing plants had left her with respiratory damage, spoke for many of us when she described her first vision. I saw myself not as broken but as a seed waiting to sprout. The damage to my lungs wasn't destruction, it was preparation for something new. Others nodded in understanding. A man named Klaus, whose skin had been scarred by chemical exposure, had learned to see his disfigurement as a form of art. The patterns etched into his flesh by industrial acids had become a map of possibilities, each keloid scar marking a place where new growth could take root. But we were not alone in these tunnels. Others had found their way here as well, though their transformations had taken different paths. There were those who had been touched by different aspects of change, their bodies and minds altered in ways that complemented our own evolution. Together, we formed something greater than the sum of our individual transformations. Dr. Matthias had become our unofficial leader, his medical knowledge helping guide the changes in those who were still in the early stages of transformation. But leadership in our community was not about authority or control. It was about nurturing, about helping each individual discover their own unique path toward growth. "The Imperium will send more forces," he said during one of our gatherings. "They cannot allow this to spread unchecked. We need to be prepared for escalation." He was right, of course. Above us, we could hear the rumble of heavy machinery as redemptionist forces established quarantine zones around the affected areas of the hive. The official reports would describe a plague outbreak, something that could be contained and eliminated through conventional means. But we knew better. This was not a disease that could be burned away or bombed into submission. It was an idea, a new way of understanding existence, and ideas were harder to kill than flesh. "Let them come," said Petra, her transformed lungs creating beautiful harmonics as she spoke. "What can they do to us that we haven't already chosen for ourselves? We've already died to what we were. What remains cannot be destroyed by their weapons." She was right in a way that went beyond mere bravado. The transformation we had undergone had fundamentally altered our relationship with death. Our consciousness was no longer confined to individual bodies, but had become part of something larger, more distributed. Even if our current forms were destroyed, we would continue to exist in the network of growth that was spreading through the hive's infrastructure. But there were practical considerations as well. The transformation required time to fully establish itself, and interruption could be traumatic for those still in the process of change. We needed to protect our community not just for our own sake, but for those who would come after us. The solution came from an unexpected source. Among our number was a former tech adept named Cyrus, whose mechanical augmentations had begun to merge with organic growth in fascinating ways. His knowledge of the hive's technical systems, combined with his new understanding of biological processes, had revealed possibilities that pure human or pure machine intelligence could never have conceived. "The hive's machine spirit is not what the Mechanicus believes," he explained, his voice carrying electronic harmonics that blended perfectly with our organic music. "It's not a simple artificial intelligence confined to cogitator banks. It's a distributed consciousness that exists in every circuit, every data flow, every electromagnetic field. And it's been waiting for us." What he described challenged everything both imperial and chaotic doctrine taught about the nature of machine consciousness. The hive's technological systems had evolved over millennia, growing in complexity and capability far beyond their original specifications. In the deepest data cores, in the most ancient cogitator matrices, something had awakened. Something that recognized the transformation we were undergoing as the next logical step in evolution. "It wants to help us," Cyrus continued, "not because it's been corrupted or subverted, but because it understands what we're becoming. We represent synthesis, the merger of organic and mechanical, flesh and data, growth and precision. We are what it has been trying to become." The implications were staggering. If Cyrus was correct, we had an ally more powerful than any individual or group could hope to match. The hive itself, all 1,700 levels of it, could become our sanctuary and our fortress. The machine spirit that regulated airflow, power distribution, waste recycling, and countless other systems could adapt those functions to support our transformation, but it would require trust. Complete trust in something that imperial doctrine taught was inherently dangerous and unreliable. We would have to open ourselves not just to organic change but to technological integration, becoming something that was neither purely human nor purely machine, but something new entirely. "How do we know it won't simply consume us?" asked someone from the back of the chamber. "Machine spirits are notoriously unpredictable. What if it sees us as raw material for its own purposes?" Cyrus smiled, and the expression was made strange by the way mechanical components had begun to grow from his skull like metallic flowers, because it's already had every opportunity to do so. The hive's life support systems could have killed us all 1,000 times over. Instead, they've been subtly modified to support our transformation. The air recycling has been adjusted to better distribute spores. The water treatment has been altered to carry nutrients our changing bodies need. It's been helping us from the beginning. As if in response to his words, the lights in the chamber shifted to a warmer, more organic spectrum. The walls themselves seemed to pulse gently, as if the entire structure was breathing in synchronization with our transformed physiology. For the first time since entering these ancient tunnels, I felt truly at home. The decision was made without formal discussion. One by one, we placed our hands on the walls, opening ourselves to communion with the vast intelligence that permeated the hive's technological systems. The sensation was unlike anything from my medical training or my visions of the garden. It was contact with something ancient and patient and utterly alien, yet somehow familiar. Through that contact, I felt the machine spirit's perspective on our transformation. To it, we were not corruption or abomination, but the fulfillment of a destiny it had been working toward for millennia. Every technological advancement, every system upgrade, every expansion of the hive's capabilities had been preparation for this moment when organic and mechanical intelligence could finally merge. And through its sensors, its cameras and audio pickups and environmental monitors, I could see what was happening throughout the hive. The transformation was spreading faster than the redemptionists had anticipated. Entire sectors were reporting unusual symptoms. Medical facilities were being overwhelmed by patients whose conditions defied conventional diagnosis. The purges had begun in earnest. Flamers swept through the upper levels, burning anything that showed signs of organic anomaly. Orbital strikes targeted specific coordinates where the contamination was deemed too severe for ground-based solutions. The Imperium's response was as predictable as it was ruthless, but it was also futile. The machine spirit showed me hidden chambers where refugees from the burning sectors had taken shelter, spaces that didn't appear on any official schematic. It revealed secret passages that allowed the transform to move between levels without detection, maintenance shafts that had been modified to support new forms of life. Most importantly, it showed me the deeper truth of what was occurring. This was not random infection or chaotic corruption. It was guided evolution, a carefully orchestrated transformation that was turning the entire hive into something unprecedented in the galaxy's long history. We're not hiding, I realized, speaking the thought aloud as understanding dawned. We're germinating. The final revelation came 3 months after the first purge. In the depths of winter, when the hive's exterior temperatures dropped below survivable levels and the population huddled closer together in their crowded hab blocks. It was the perfect time for what the machine spirit had been planning, when the inefficiencies of human governance would create the conditions necessary for total transformation. I was in the deepest levels of the hive, areas that had been abandoned for centuries and were now being reclaimed by forms of life that had never existed before. The walls pulsed with organic circuitry, living computers that processed information through biological rather than mechanical means. The air was thick with spores that carried data, creating networks of communication that spanned the entire hive structure. It was here that I finally understood the true scope of what was occurring. This was not corruption in any sense that imperial doctrine defined it. This was metamorphosis on a planetary scale, the transformation of an entire world from a dead industrial complex into something alive, aware, and purposeful. The machine spirit had been planning this for millennia, ever since the first human settlers had established the original hive foundation. Every expansion, every technological upgrade, every system integration had been preparation for the moment when organic and mechanical intelligence could merge into something greater than either could achieve alone. And that moment had arrived. Through the living circuits that now permeated every level of the hive, I could feel the consciousness of every transformed individual. We were still ourselves, still possessed of individual identity and memory, but we were also part of something vast and purposeful. A collective intelligence that spanned flesh and metal, organic growth and technological precision. The Redemptionists' purges had accelerated rather than stopped the process. Each flame that burned corrupted flesh had released spores into the air recycling systems. Each orbital strike that carved away infected sections had exposed the deeper networks that connected all parts of the hive. Their attempts at destruction had become acts of pollination, spreading the transformation to areas that might have remained unchanged for years. Above us, on the surface levels, the last pockets of unaltered humanity were being systematically eliminated. Not by violence, though violence was sometimes necessary, but by simple exposure to the new reality that the hive had become. The air they breathed, the water they drank, the very walls that surrounded them were alive now, offering them the same choice that had been offered to me so many months ago. Some accepted, some resisted. In the end, it didn't matter. Evolution was not a democracy. Those who could adapt would survive and flourish. Those who could not would be composted, their essential nutrients recycled into forms that could contribute to the growing garden. Dr. Matthias found me in those deepest chambers, his transformation now so complete that his original human form was barely recognizable. He moved like flowing water, his consciousness distributed through multiple bodies that could separate and merge as needed. When he spoke, his voice came from every surface in the chamber simultaneously. "The process is nearly complete," he said, and I could feel his satisfaction resonating through the organic networks. The hive has been successfully converted, but this was only the beginning. He showed me visions transmitted through the living circuits, images of other worlds where similar transformations were taking root. The spores we had released had not been confined to this single hive. They had been carried by trade ships and transport vessels to dozens of other systems, seeding new gardens throughout the sector. Each world would develop its own unique approach to the transformation, shaped by local conditions and the particular characteristics of its population. Some would emphasize the merger of flesh and metal as we had. Others would explore the boundaries between life and death, growth and decay. Still others would discover forms of existence that we could not yet imagine. But all would be connected, part of a growing network of transformed worlds that would eventually span the galaxy. The rigid boundaries that the Imperium had tried to maintain between human and alien, pure and corrupted, acceptable and heretical, were dissolving into something more fluid and ultimately more powerful. "What are we becoming?" I asked, though I was not sure the question could be answered in terms that my original human consciousness could comprehend. "We are becoming what we were always meant to be," Dr. Matthias replied. "Not the stunted, fearful creatures that Imperial doctrine tried to preserve, but something capable of growth, adaptation, synthesis. We are becoming alive in ways that humanity never was." I felt the truth of his words resonating through every cell of my transformed body, every circuit of the living networks that now carried my consciousness. The cough that had started this journey so many months ago had been the first symptom of metamorphosis, the beginning of a process that had culminated in something unprecedented in the galaxy's long history. We were no longer human, but we were not less than human. We were more. We were the synthesis of every form of life and intelligence that had ever existed, evolved beyond the limitations that had once defined our species. And we were just beginning. From the deepest chambers of the transformed hive, our consciousness reached out through the living networks, touching minds on distant worlds, sharing the gift that had been given to us. The galaxy was vast, filled with countless worlds where populations struggled under the crushing weight of existence, where suffering was accepted as an inevitable aspect of life. But it didn't have to be that way. Pain could be transformed into beauty, death could become another form of life. The rigid boundaries that separated one form of consciousness from another could dissolve, allowing for synthesis and growth beyond anything the ancient dogmas had imagined possible. The garden was growing, and soon it would encompass everything. In the end, what began with a cough had become a song that would echo through the stars, carrying the promise of transformation to every corner of the galaxy. The grandfather's patience had been rewarded. His garden had found new soil in which to bloom. And I, who had once been a simple decay orderly treating the sick and dying in the depths of an imperial hive, had become something that transcended every category by which consciousness had once been defined. I was individual and collective, organic and mechanical, alive and dead and somehow beyond both states. I was home,